What's up, boys and girls? This is Pete Clark here, and today we're going to answer one of the age-old poker questions. How do you truly master this game? Is it with a GTO approach or an exploitative approach? Now, clearly this question becomes a bit silly when it forces you to choose one of these approaches. So what we're going to do today is pour a nice cup of coffee here and clear up once and for all how to blend these two completely necessary components of the game together in a way that is not unnecessarily mutually exclusive, in a way that doesn't force you into choosing a camp in a really polarizing and silly eliminative way. Today we're just going to merge them together, we're going to blend them in a harmonious way, and we're going to master this game. So stay tuned for some hand examples, some solver outputs, and of course some cool little drawings. Let's get into it. Let's be honest about this. This is one of these subjects that it's really easy to polarize people on. You can actually see factions developing in poker. You have those that argue that theory is the true light and you should simply copy the solver output. At the furthest extreme of the GTO camp, the proponents of this position actually say that our goal, our source of EV, where our money comes from at the tables, is getting as close as possible to the output of this robot playing against itself over billions and trillions of iterations, trying to mimic exactly what it's doing at exactly the right frequencies, having 4 or 5 or 6 different sizing options and knowing how to master them all, that this is the magic bean that will grow the beanstalk of poker success. It's not, my friends. GTO is a way of understanding the game. It's a framework. It's a way of understanding how things function in theory, so that you can see the different factors that affect ranges, EV, how ranges should be played. But the real beauty of GTO, the real benefit of learning how the game works objectively, is learning how people fail to actually mimic the robot. They might think that they're playing some form of game theory optimal poker. They're generally not, unless they're cheating. They're exhibiting all kinds of human errors, even at higher stakes. The top regs make mistakes day in, day out. You can see this if you study high stakes hands. On the other hand, there are those who say GTO is to be done away with. It's complete garbage and it has absolutely no place in our game, and that's an equally absurd position. Exploitative poker is super important, but it doesn't actually make sense to exploit someone unless you know what they're doing wrong. Okay, in like the most brutish caveman way, you can maybe say, oh, this guy's calling too much, so I'm gonna not bluff him here. Sure, but like until you get to the nitty-gritty, the ins and outs of how ranges should function objectively, it's very hard to see what your opponents are actually doing wrong, especially when they're not like wild and obvious fish, shall we say, recreationals. Not meant to say fish these days, of course. So what it's all about is understanding that our money does come mostly from exploitative play. That's where the huge swings come. Like when your opponent's doing something wrong, he's deviating from GTO, and then you also deviate, but you do it in the way that punishes him. Like if I was playing scissors all the time in rock, paper, scissors, and you did rock every time, you would be maximally exploiting me, right? I would lose every single time my strategy is being exploited by yours. So it would be a really absurd thing to say that the best strategy in rock, paper, scissors against a guy that only ever does scissors is to mix rock, paper, and scissors and thus break even, winning 33%, tying 33%, losing 33%. No, the best strategy is pure rock. But in poker, you do get situations that are maybe not quite that strong, but they're really strong exploitatively that you must take advantage of. But it's just in poker, the theory is way more complex than just there's a rock, there's paper, there's scissors, and they all beat each other in this triangulating way. Actually, in poker, unless you've studied formal theory, you're going to miss what the baseline EV of things is supposed to be. You'll miss how range construction should actually work, and thus you won't be able to see what your opponent's doing wrong and how to take advantage of it. So I'm going to show you a hand now that kind of proves this point. So in this first spot today, we have King Jack in the small blind. We're in a single raise pot, very common wide range scenario. We open, villain is unknown for now, but we're going to posit a few different kind of opponent types in a minute and see how each of them is going to affect our decision here. We go for check, that green X there, if you haven't seen it before. It's the same color that Pio Solver uses when it checks. A very mellow passive. I'm just going to check here, sort of green. So it checks, villain checks back, and we reach the deuce of spades turn. So how does the spot go theoretically? Like if you don't have a feel for that, it's going to be very difficult to actually know what you're supposed to be deviating from. If you're just in the hardcore, I'm going to exploit him here camp, you need to know what his range is meant to be for checking behind on the flop before you can compare what it actually is to that and then find an exploit. And if you're in the pure GTO camp here, you're going to miss all of the lovely ways in which humans in the games that you guys watching this play are wildly unbalanced when they check back the flop as big blind here. We saw last week on YouTube that Villain is meant to be checking back a lot of top pair flush draws on this flop, etc. And it's not really going to happen. Let's take a look at our GTO guru today, Pile Solver, which will not tell us how to punish our opponent directly, but we can be quite clever with the output here and actually look at the solver and ask it, what's he doing differently and how do we punish it? Again, just using our ethos here that we want to blend both of these approaches to the game together. So let's take a look at solver output here. So in this spot, we've checked the flop, Villain has checked back, and this is Pile's recommendation for what we should do on the turn. It basically thinks that many hands are indifferent to slow playing again. King Jack, for example, is one of those. This hand is basically going to be similar EV, betting small, betting big, or checking. We don't have an overbet at this spot, and the game theory concept at work there is that flush turns they're very symmetrical for both ranges, so we don't have a large nut advantage on this turn, and therefore we're not going to be leveraging the top of our range with large sizing. If we start to do that, we end up value betting hands that block our opponent's continuing range heavily, and we kind of force him into an equally polarized situation where he can continue mainly flushes into spade hands and fold other stuff if we were to overbet here, and that doesn't really give him much of a dilemma to solve, nor does it maximize our EV in theory. So what we're basically doing here is using smaller bets, and you can probably simplify this to just one of these sizes, or you can use two if you prefer. But what's really interesting today is how to blend theory with practice. You know, is it GTO? Is it exploits? That's like asking, is it salt or is it sugar? What's the best? Live off of only one for the rest of your life. You know, you have a cup of tea and you're screwed if you chose salt, and then you have some fries, and if you chose sugar, you're an idiot. So it's really a silly question, but I'll show you how to blend them both together. Have salt in your fries and sugar in your coffee, right? Or not. I'm fasting, so I don't have any sugar in this, but, you know, point stands. So let's look at King Jack of clubs. That's the hand that we hold here in our example. We can do either, right? That tells us the frequencies. If we click this little button here that says strategy EV, Pio will be kind enough to tell us the EV difference between our lines, and as we can see, there's very little. The accuracy here is not sufficient for this sim that we can say with certainty what the theoretical EV is of each of these options, but it's basically very close, right? That's why you see it mixing. Solvers only mix, guys, if the EV of their options is the same. They will never do something bad to themselves sometimes to set up something good in future. In other words, loss leaders are not a thing in poker, as we call them. So that's not a thing. Basically, these lines have the same EV. Why should I choose one over the other then? Because the thing is, in practice, here's the kicker, they don't have the same EV. Well, the kicker's the king, but, you know, the kicker to the argument is that these don't have the same EV in practice. One of these lines is better than the other. It's probably not overbet, because theoretically that's the line with the biggest EV loss. That's the line that we're supposed to avoid, but it's not even that horrendous, as you can see here. Still gets us 55 chips out of a pot that's 60. That's quite a lot of chips. And the other lines, as you can see, are very, very close. So which is better? Well, to answer this question exploitatively, what we need to do is look at Villain's reaction on the node before this node, so the decision point he had before we got here, which is the flop, and what he's going to do next against all of our options. So let's do the one in the past first of all. We'll work chronologically here. If we were to check the flop, he was supposed to check back with lots of spade draws at quite high frequencies. As we can see here, these nut spade draws are pure checking, almost ace 10, almost pure checking, ace 9 doing a lot of checking, ace deuce even doing some checking. Weaker spade draws like queen 4 still doing some checking. So my first kind of argument here would be that I think the average opponent at the stakes that most of you guys play online is doing way less checking with flush draws than the solver. What does this mean? Well, it means that on the deuce of clubs his range is much weaker, and we're going to have more success bluffing, less success with kind of stacking him flush over flush when we have a flush, but more success sort of thin value betting for a bit of denial and value at the same time, and obviously maybe checking and inducing bluffs because he's going to have a lot of air. The other thing I would say is that Villain has more air here than we would expect, because I don't think he's finding the requisite bluff frequency with things like queen 9 of diamonds, just a nothing hand that's meant to be bluffing flop often here. People don't really see that. They want to have some kind of safety blanket. They want to have the flush draw, they want to have a spade, or they want to have a gutter to bet here, but you don't need that, because you're in position, you're bluffing hands that are low EV whatever you do, and they're the same EV to bluff as they are to check in theory. So basically, in a nutshell, I think that Villain will arrive, if you guys play, let's say, 100 zoom, I think Villain will arrive on the turn here with a range that is too poor in Jack X, too poor in like flush draws, and is just basically going to have far too many air hands and low pairs, etc, etc. So what this means is that when we have king jack of clubs, which is the hand, remember, that we actually have in our example here, it becomes the case that there's ways that we can deviate now. We can start to intelligently figure out, based on our exploitative assumptions and comparing them to what villain was supposed to do, what the best play is here. Let's get back to the solver and forge out a strategy now. So let's look at what happens here after we bet small. So now villain is meant to have all these flushes that can raise us, right, and bluff raises to go with them. The raise frequency here is 6%. I think in practice the raise frequency here will be tiny, like it'll basically never happen because the flushes are going to be rarer and the bluffs are a bit counterintuitive. To check back the flop with an airball and then raise a bet, it's a little bit weird, so only the sort of most GTO based studied players are really going to be finding that play. So the first thing I want to say is that when we have king jack, we get raised less often, which is probably kind of a good thing, kind of a bad thing. A good thing in that he has less flushes, a bad thing in that he's not going to bluff us probably as often either. But yeah, getting raised not very much is fine. Obviously what we're mainly looking at here is getting called. So the thing about king jack is now that it's actually a thicker value bet, and the reason for that is that villain has a lower propensity of having a hand that beats us and just a higher frequency of having low pairs. So stuff like pocket 8s in villain's range is going to be more abundant now, based on our exploitative retier 3s, 4s. These weaker hands are calling various ace high combos with or without a spade that are supposed to peel a turn bet, that kind of thing, king 10 combos with a spade. These are probably going to become more common, so obviously betting thinner for value is good, so betting has now gone up in EV. What about checking? Well, that's going to depend on how often he bluffs, right? How often do people bluff here? With, again, the naked queen 8 of diamonds, I don't think very much, right? So I actually think what happens in practice here against the average sort of tame reg at 100 or 50 zoom, or perhaps even like the average recreational, is that their range is weaker, they don't bluff enough if checked to, and they have lots of worse hands that they can call if we bet. So basically what's going to happen through our EV here is that betting small is probably going to become, or even betting larger with this hand, is going to become the best play against many players, and you can feel free to just always take that line. I don't think that, obviously villain is aggro, there's an exception here, but I don't think that in general check will perform as well as bet, even though the solver tells me I can do either. Last week I was arguing for checking, this week I'm actually saying yeah, it's okay in theory, but when they check back here, they're too capped, they're not really bluffing enough when checked to, with absolute garbage, and they're going to call the spade hands anyway that would bluff if checked to. So one thing you don't want to do here is say, oh, I want to check and get him to bet a flush draw, because he's going to call or raise a flush draw if you bet anyway, right? So it's not really important. What you want to look for here is hands that would invest one way but wouldn't invest the other way. So for example, if he has a lot of 3s here, that's a hand that would call a bet but wouldn't make a bet itself very frequently, so thus we're incentivized to bet here. So you can see how it's not really correct to just stop at the idea that like we can follow theory here or we can exploit. We need to know what the theory is. We need to know how often his range is meant to check back those stronger hands. We need to know how often he's meant to bluff the queen 8 of diamonds in order to actually get to the conclusion that we should bet king jack of clubs. So it's a really interesting thing, but we really want to blend both of these points together in a healthy way that allows us to use both approaches, both GTO foundations, understanding how EV works, how ranges work, and exploits, in order to come up with the best strategy. Let's change the spot slightly now, and let's actually imagine that we have king 5. We have the airball hand now instead of king jack. Well, how's this going to change? So we've basically said that villain's range is weaker now. We've looked at the theory already. We've seen what it's supposed to be. He has less flushes. He has less probably flush draws as well. He has less top pair now. So basically now our bluffing EV has gone way up. So if we go back to the solver for a second here and just take a look at what it thought about how often we should bluff king 5 of clubs in this turn spot, undoubtedly it's going to be a mix, but let's take a look. It's going to be an optional thing. I stand corrected, it's actually a pure check, but the EVs are very similar between betting small and checking. When you go down to a hand like king 4, it's actually very happy to bluff. So you can see here king 3, king 4, king 5. When we reach king 5, we hit apparently like just enough showdown value that checking is not so good. Perhaps the 5 is even doing something here, like blocking folding range a bit more by blocking queen 5 or I don't know, something like that. But I don't think it's a big deal. I think without getting lost in the weeds here, the thing to really say is the EVs are close whether you bet or check with king 5. So the thing to avoid is looking at this green box and it just saying check, don't bet this hand, because the EV swing here is not particularly big. So when we sort of stipulate, the villain has way more combinations now of bad hands, air balls, queen high, ace high, stuff without a spade, stuff without two spades, what's actually going to happen is that the EV of bet is going to soar. The EV of check is also going to improve a little bit probably, and that's because he's going to underbluff the turn, I think, with the really bad hands. However, he might bet too mergy. He might end up betting like, I don't know, like a medium strength hand like at 7 too frequently or something now, which will end up causing us, queen 7 here is going to bet more than that, I think. So that's going to cause us to not realize that much equity. So that's kind of a bad thing when we've got nothing, right? It's a good thing when we've got like a pair of jacks, but when we've got nothing, it kind of sucks if he stops us from having the chance to hit a king. So king 5 here, I think we should just bet. It's quite close to a bet anyway. King 4 you can see is completely fine, so I'm willing to say that we can bluff a little bit further up into our king X region here, king 5. Obviously like king 9 and stuff, these hands just have a bit more EV when called anyway, so they're better bluffs, but I think we can bluff king 5. I don't care about whatever anomaly, whatever like thing is causing the solver to think bet king 4 but not king 5. Like how applicable would that be? Like how sensible would it be to try to learn a strategy where king 4 and king 9 are bets here and king 5 isn't? Come on guys, this is clearly not how we're learning the game. If we're trying to do that, we're missing a trick. We're getting it really wrong, because we're not even adding real EV, we're just adding this theoretical ghost EV by learning that concept. The fact that king 5 is all green there, that is always checking, is based on something that's probably only relevant in the solver's world and not in our own world, so very important point. So we've seen that we should probably bet big with king jack, we've seen that we should also bet with king 5 based on how pool has built its flop checking range. How should we act with pocket 8s now? Well, again, the idea is that villain's going to probably not bluff enough bad stuff if we check. The idea is that he is going to have too captive a range, so we can thin value bet more effectively now. So, you know, by far now the most obvious play with pocket 8s is a small bet. The big bet with pocket 8s is probably okay as well, honestly. It's not as bad as it looks, but I think small betting here just makes a ton of sense. You're not going to get raised as often as you should, like we talked about. So with 8s here, I would use the same exploits to basically argue again for a deviation from the solver output, meaning instead of mixing bet with check and just being like, this hand is a mix, I'm going to mix against this 100 zoom reg that's just a tight, you know, normal player who doesn't do much. What you should actually do, of course not all 100 zoom regs are tight and don't do much, there's some active ones as well, but what you should do against the sort of ABC player here is definitely just bet your hand with 8s, because there's not going to be enough bluffing happening and the range is going to be too weak from the flop. So sometimes you just want to fall back on some old school ideas here, like bet when their range is weak and you have a vulnerable hand that can get value. Like, it's not a bad thing. That said, we needed to know how they should build their flop strategy, how they should build their turn continuing range in order to actually come to these conclusions. We could go into way more detail on this, but today, as I say, my main sort of idea is to answer the age-old question of, is it GTO or is it exploits? And clearly the answer is both. It's understanding theory and the factors that affect range construction, EV, all of that first, and then it's taking it to the real world. The real money lies in the second part of this. The real swing in profitability lies in countering your opponent's strategy with a very good strategy of your own, but the theory gives you a solid baseline to ensure that you're not making blunders left, right and center. If you're 3-betting 6-4 suited small blind versus button, you're making a blunder right off the bat, so you need to know that these things are bad, and many more complex and more subtle things. And you also need to know what factors affect profitability so that you can adjust from there. I have a very simple poker ethos. I teach this in my Discord. I wrote this post a couple of hours ago this morning just to make sure that people understood what we were all about and our sort of mission statement over at the Carrot Poker Discord. We run schools, we run classes. I work with people one-to-one. I stream. Like, we're kind of like a teaching business now. We have lots of strong players in our server and we give feedback to people of all strengths, and we have a lot of pros giving that feedback, but it's very important to be clear about what our mission statement is, and it's the following. So basically, point 1 is that theoretical study helps us understand how ranges and EV function objectively and what an unexploitable and good strategy looks like. Secondly, our human understanding is what helps us see how others will deviate from that, usually accidentally, but in some cases on purpose as well, right, from that output. Point 3 is that the larger EV gains that we can actually get, compared with those we can get by choosing one line over another line in solver land and equilibrium and GTO, we can actually get big gains caused by using the right deviations. So otherwise, in other words, when your opponent is playing way too much rock, you usually need to play a lot of paper, right? That's the deviation, and that's where the real money is made, guys. That's a super important thing that the people that are in the hardcore GTO camp just completely miss, and just miss out on loads of EV, but the people in the hardcore exploitative camp just miss point one and are basically flailing around in the dark, in my opinion. Most of them, some of them might have like a good intuition about what's good and what's not, and might sort of implicitly understand theory, but most students don't implicitly understand poker theory because it's not very intuitive, and that's why you have to study it. Point 4 is that if our goal is to maximize profits from playing poker, which clearly it is for most of you watching this, we should devote time to understanding both game theory and then practice how and why our opponents deviate from game theory, and then how to deviate to exploit those deviations. It's a bit meta, but we need to figure out how they're deviating, and we need to deviate in the right way. The funny thing is, and the final point I'll make today, is that if you are actually randomly just playing an exploitative strategy or just playing a bad strategy without really knowing what you're doing, you might be accidentally building a strategy that's all rock against a guy that plays all paper. So another thing is you can exploit yourself by just flailing around in the dark and not really having the right reads or having the right base game plan or understanding of theory. So I hope this video has been really helpful. One thing I'd like to show you guys just before I shoot off today is that we are selling a product in our store right now over at carrotcorner.com that is exactly using the same formula that we talked about today. That product is called Pio versus Population. It's an e-magazine, meaning that it's a PDF file that you download to your computer when you purchase it. It's only $6.99 per episode, but episode 5 is completely free. If you want to get a flavor, head on over to carrotcorner.com and grab yourself a free copy of episode 5 of Pio versus Population. You'll see us outline the theory. You'll see us outline what people are doing wrong, like how humans are going wrong, and then what to do about it. If you like that, you can even grab what we call our mega bundle, which is the episode 1 to 10 sort of box set, if you like. If you forgive this looks like some old VCR collection, it's actually just e-magazines, there's no physical product. Just want to make that clear, but it's only $44.99 for 10 episodes. They're about 15 to 16 pages long, and they're written by a guy called James. Well, the first few are written by me, the rest are written by a guy called James, who's an extremely strong professional poker player and very good writer to boot. So do check that out at carrotcorner.com. We'll be bringing you guys lots more videos soon, and in the meantime, I urge you strongly to remember that this is not a battle. This is not two tribes going at each other. It's not two nations at war. This is two completely essential components to a healthy game plan. First the theory, then the exploits. Most of the money comes from the right hand side of this, but that's only assuming you've mastered the left hand side. Without it, the exploits don't mean anything, and you might be losing so much money on the GTO side by being so horribly just wrong about EV in general that it doesn't matter if you're good exploitatively, you just lose lots of money anyway. So you do need both of these approaches, guys. I hope this has cleared it up. I don't want to hear anyone else say, oh, it's exploits, oh, it's GTO. Clearly it's a blend, right? Clearly. If you disagree, feel free to leave a comment below. If you agree, let me know. If you like the video, do give it a little like and a comment, and remember to subscribe. It helps me grow this channel. I really appreciate it, guys. See you in the next video. Bye for now. Much love. Take it easy.